All right, if you'll open up to James chapter 2, we're going to quickly finish up the few remaining questions we had from lesson 1, and then continue on through the epistle of James, and hopefully get to the beginning of chapter 4. We'll see if that's a little too ambitious or not. But if you were here last time, you'll remember that we left off at the beginning of James chapter 2. He brings up the problem of partiality that these brethren were showing, that when a wealthy man, someone who was clearly just by their appearance wealthy, they had gold rings and fine apparel, they would give them great attention, tell them to sit in the best seats of the synagogue. But meanwhile, the poor, they were saying, "You go sit at my footstool." They were dishonoring them with the way that they treated them. And in so doing, they had set themselves in the judgment seat. And not a just judge, not a godly judge, but a judge with evil thoughts. And we discussed right at the end of last lesson that these were the same people that were persecuting them and oppressing them and dragging them into courts, and on top of that, blaspheming the name of Christ. And yet they chose to honor them and to dishonor the poor. And Cody, is this just a minor issue that James is pointing out? Or is this something greater than that?
Yeah, so starting verse 9 says, "But if you show partiality, you commit sin, and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.' Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law." So I think clearly the point is simple. God shows no partiality. Peter says that in Acts 10:34. We're told in Galatians 2:6 and many other passages. So therefore, he expects us not to show partiality. Or we'll be committing sin, and sin separates us from God. There is no such thing as a minor sin. Revelation 21:8 goes through a host of sins that will separate us eternally. One of those is lying, which many people think is a minor sin, so that doesn't exist.
Right. And we understand this, right? That, what do we call somebody that has been convicted for stealing? We call them a criminal, a lawbreaker. Now, that does not mean that they broke literally every single one of our laws, but they did break one, and they were convicted of that, and the judgment was brought on them for that. And so in the same way, just as he says here, if you commit adultery, or if you don't commit adultery, but you do murder, you're still a transgressor of the law. And in showing partiality here, though they might have considered this to be something very slight, they are still transgressing against the law because they're not loving their neighbor. And so judgment is going to come. And he reminds them in verse 12, "So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty." And so he is desperately trying to get them to take themselves out of that judgment seat that they had put themselves in deeming who was worthy of honor and dishonor, and instead realize that far from being the judge, you are the one that's going to be judged. And if you recognize that you're going to be judged by the law of liberty, then would you not want mercy? And so he draws a conclusion in verse 13. Chris, if we want to obtain that mercy, how must we behave?
So in verse 13 it says, "For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy." So the inverse of that is also true, that if you want mercy shown to you, you must show mercy. Jesus says as much in Matthew chapter 7. He says, Matthew 7, verse 1, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with what measure you use, it will be measured back to you." You gave the great example of the unforgiving servant. So it's whatever judgment you hand down is going to be turned back to you one day. So in this example, if you show mercy, it'll be shown to you.
Right. We're going to be judged, but we hope that God's going to show us mercy, and he's given us promises of that. But if we take that mercy that we have been shown and don't carry that on to our dealings with people through our lives, how can we expect that mercy to be given to us? We are supposed to reflect the mercy of God in the way that we treat others. These people were not showing any mercy to the poor. They were looking at them as someone not even worth their time. But they they were casting judgment instead. And he says here, mercy triumphs over judgment. And again, this makes sense to us, right? What would be the point of mercy if it didn't triumph over judgment? It is that very aspect of it that makes it so important. And so that is a nobler aim that they should be aiming for. And certainly, that's what they are going to need. They should carry that forward in their own lives. All right, looking at lesson 2 now, if you have that with you. This section of James chapter 2 is probably one of the most controversial in the New Testament. Certainly, the faith alone doctrines have a lot of issue with this, and this is why, really, Martin Luther had some contentions with this epistle of whether it should be included or not. But I hope that as we move through here pretty quickly tonight, just because of our time constraints, we realize that faith and works are not something that are pitted against each other. They're not battling against each other, but rather the point James is going to be making is that these two things must be together, and they work together perfectly. So to start us off, Lance, what does a worthless, dead faith look like, based on what James says here in chapter 2?
Well, a faith that is worthless or dead is a faith that has no actions or works to accompany it. We can say we have faith, but if we do not show that we have faith by our actions or works, our faith is dead and is useless, being by itself. So if you look at verse 17, it says, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Then he uses something interesting here. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? So faith and works must go hand in hand, and we show people our faith by the works and actions that we do for our God.
Right. Yeah, the conclusion of his question there is, someone says, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You can't. That's the challenge he is putting there. It really can't be met. How can you show your faith without works? And looking at verse 15, this example he gives, that if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you don't give them the things which are needed for the body, then what does it profit? The point here is that, the words that they're saying are good things, right? That they should be provided for and be warmed and be filled. But those words by themselves with no action based on them are completely worthless. They don't do anything. And so if those works don't follow with this confession of faith, then what value are they? They're not any value to any of the people around them, and they're certainly of no value to the one that has this faith. And so, again, a faith by itself without works is dead. It doesn't really exist. But we move on to this example of Abraham, and then just a little bit later, Rahab. Jeff, what does it mean when he says that Abraham's faith was made perfect by works?
So here we see a contrast of this foolish fellow's dead faith or useless faith compared to Abraham. And it says in verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. It says here his faith was perfected, and I don't believe that would mean that Abraham was perfect, because we know in Romans 3, verse 23, that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It did, but what we do see is his faith was perfected. And I think he's tying that back to what he started in, James spoke of in chapter 1, where he says in verse 2, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let that endurance have its perfect result, so that it may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. His ultimate test was Abraham was told his son, the son of promise, was going to be sacrificed, and put that ultimate test to Abraham to test his faith. And he passed that test. He was willing to sacrifice his son, knowing that God would save him or resurrect him or provide a solution. But he knew God would keep his promise. So his faith was perfect in the fact that it was complete, mature, a genuine faith, and obviously an acting and working faith, contrasted with this dead faith that had no works.
Right, right. And, really, when we look out throughout Abraham's life, constantly his faith is leading him to action based on that faith. And that's why he is such a great example for us today. And I like that connection you made to the first chapter, that the perfectness being the completeness. And so the idea I get here, again, is that without the works, that faith is not complete, right? It's dead. It's missing something. But in following his faith and being willing to offer his own son on that altar, his faith was working together with his works, and therefore, when those things came together, his faith was made complete. Whereas before, without those works, it would be dead or incomplete. And so, again, what we see here is not faith and works battling it out, but working together, and really they must work together is the conclusion here. To have a saving faith, a faith that is alive, that faith must be working. There's no other way to have a saving faith. And again, he also gives this example of Rahab, that likewise was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way. This justified by works. There are people who would flat out just simply deny this, right? And say exactly the opposite of what James is saying here. And so I think it's important that we clarify what we mean by this. And so, Matt, can you explain what justification by works means and what it may not mean?
So justification or being made righteous by works, we do that in the sense that our works are a validation of our faith. It's a demonstration of our faith. How do I know that Abraham believed God when he said, "I'm going to make of you a great nation"? Is because, as Jeff said, he was willing to take his son and put him up on the altar, knowing that God would do something to still make that happen. Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, she said, "I know that God has given you this land and that you're going to take it over." How do we know that she really believed that? In what she chose to do to demonstrate that faith by hiding the two spies. I think one other Old Testament example that showcases that in the extreme in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, Jehoshaphat is surprised by Moab and Ammon and the men of Mount Seir, and he pours out this beautiful prayer to God, and the prophet comes back and he says, "You don't worry, God's going to take care of this for you." Well, how do I know that Jehoshaphat believed that? Because the next morning, as he's going towards the battle, he puts the singers up front, and they're singing out to God. What a statement of faith there by showing it. So works validate someone's faith, and they demonstrate and confirm that faith to God. I mean, he knows our hearts, but it shows it to God. It shows it to other people so they can see that we believe what we believe. And in some sense, as I said, God knows, but sometimes we're not sure if we know. So when God asks us to do something and we're willing to do it, it's a validation of our faith to ourselves as well. When he said, "Go sacrifice your son" to Abraham, that's the time of, do I really believe what God says that he's going to do, and I'm willing to do that? And so I think in that sense, it's just a validation of what our faith is. And in no way, and I think that example of Jehoshaphat shows that as well, is it an earning of God owes us something like that, because you don't put the singers down front. That's not the way to win a battle. That's just a way to show that you believe what God says he's going to do.
Yeah, I love that example. I had not thought of that specific one. But yes, this is not meritorious deeds, meaning that God owes us justification, salvation. That's not what we're talking about, perfect law keeping, earning that. But it is a demonstration and a proof of what our faith really is. I think of Stephen's lessons on faith recently, and that idea of allegiance to the king. How does the king know that their servant is true to them and is loyal to them? Well, they answer the call to battle, to fight on their behalf. They pay their taxes, and they listen to the king's decrees. How do you know that someone is not faithful or loyal to the king? Well, they don't answer, and they sit at home, or they completely ignore the things that the king has decreed and go directly against that and rebel against that. It's clear who is faithful and who is not in that way. And so in that same way, this justification by works, it is that through these deeds that we see in those examples in Abraham and Rahab and Jehoshaphat, we see their faith moving them to act. And doing so, their faith is made perfect. And so just a passage that I think is very important for us to understand and be able to help others understand, and also just a very encouraging one in the examples that we see. All right, so moving on to chapter 3. He starts off here with something that may seem a little strange. He says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." And there are plenty of passages in Scripture that we see that commend us to be good teachers, and that is an aim that we should have, right? And yet he is saying that let not many of you become teachers. Again, I think that we can have a balance here, that I think that we should make it a goal to be able to teach others. I mean, that is, we want souls to be saved, and how will they be saved without teaching? But we must absolutely be sure that we understand the weight of responsibility that is on us when we teach others. That there is a stricter judgment there. Why is there a stricter judgment? Because we're handling God's word, and it needs to be handled with care. And what is the responsibility but other people's souls on the line? And so this is a great responsibility. And so we need to have at least a little bit of hesitation, might not be the right word, but recognition that before we step into this for the wrong reasons. And one thing I'd like to point out here is consider his audience and how the Jews viewed the Pharisees, right? They held them up to great esteem. And this is a people that we already know had a lot of problems with envying the kind of the nobility, the wealthy in the area, wanting just a touch of that greatness. And so it would not be hard to see that someone may want to lift themselves up into a position of teaching to kind of obtain some of that notoriety or greatness. And James wants them to have pause. Let not many of you do this, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. And verse 2, "For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." And so James brings up here, and he's going to be talking about for a little while, just how difficult it is to contain the tongue and to make sure that we do not use our tongues in such a way as to stumble. Going as far as to say that if anyone doesn't stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. And again, I think a perfect, complete, mature person. When we're born, we have these arms and these legs, and they're kind of useless at first, right? We kind of slowly understand how to use them, how to use our necks, how to walk, and we kind of gain control over our limbs. But the tongue, throughout our lives, we struggle to bring that into control. And so he's going to give a lot of examples here of just how powerful the tongue is and how much danger is there. And before we go into that, I just want to turn over to Matthew 15. I think this is something important for us to understand as we go through this. Matthew 15, and starting in verse 16. "So Jesus said, 'Are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. And so Jesus calls out here that the mouth, the tongue, is not just in a vacuum. Where are these words coming from? These words that defile us, but from the heart. And so, turning back to James 3, as we go through this, keep in mind that the heart and the tongue, there's a direct connection there. And if we're having tongue problems, there are heart problems behind that. But moving to his examples here, Carrie, can you explain his illustrations that he starts out with in verses 2 through 5?
Sure. You just got through reading verse 2 of chapter 3. I think verse 5 goes directly with that. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. The tongue, our speech, it can bring both good and evil. Picking up from verse 10, out of the mouth proceeds both blessings and cursings. It controls direction. Our speech controls our attitude. And picking up in verses 3 and 4, given examples of how something small, something part of a whole has great influence on the whole. In verse 3, talking about the bit that's in a horse's mouth, it controls the direction and the temperament and the attitude of that horse. The small rudder, in comparison to the size of a ship, it controls that ship. It controls the attitude and the direction. Same thing with us, our tongue, our speech. It has influence on the direction of our lives, our relationship with God, our relationship with fellow man.
Right. And yeah, it's such a small thing, right? A bit compared to a horse, a rudder compared to a ship. And I like your focus on the direction, right? Used well, then great things can happen. A horse can be put to great use and do a lot of work when controlled well. A ship can certainly, think of all of the things that a ship can move. But if it's not directed and it's just loose, then what profit is there? And so just in that same way, our tongue is a very little member compared to the rest of our body, and yet it can accomplish a lot. It can accomplish a lot for good, and it can certainly accomplish a lot for evil. And so we need to be wary of that. And he says that the tongue is a fire, right? How great a forest a little fire kindles, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. Very strong language here. Sam, can you give us some examples of how the tongue can defile our whole bodies or set on fire the course of nature?
Well, I was going to start out with the verses you just read from Matthew, but we'll forego that. But the things that the tongue speaks comes from the heart. It's not something it's not just a flappy member, but it's driven by our thoughts and our mind. But when we speak evil thoughts, they can gender strife, they can cause hard feelings, they can cause resentment, malice, etc., and stir someone else up to sin with their tongue or with their actions because we've incited them. Careless words, gossip, and slander can separate friends, associates, co-workers, and our brethren. Words that are untrue or ultimately or untimely spoken can ruin reputations. False words can lead to the division of relationships, conflicts, and discord within the church. Unkind words can lead to ruined marriages and loss of parental and child relationships. Speaking profane words can cause us to be separated from God, and our words can destroy our influence and our character.
Yeah, I think those are all great examples. The illustration of the fire spreading, I think gossip just goes so well with that. And I appreciate you calling attention that it can lead others to sin with our sinful words. And so we must be aware of that. We must recognize the power that words can have. I'm sure that everyone in this room can think of somebody who did set on fire their whole lives and just brought themselves to ruin merely with words. It can be a disastrous thing. And so he moves on from that to say that, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. And you could read that and you could just kind of despair, right? Or just say, well, what's the point? Do we just give up? And I don't think that's at all what James is saying. He wouldn't be giving us all of these warnings if there wasn't something we should be doing about it. But I think for us to understand this, he says that for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. When we tame an animal, then the idea is that they can be, let with some freedoms in understanding that they're not going to bring harm, right? We've tamed, dogs and cats, and then you can be around them without thinking that they're going to attack you. But not so with the tongue. We can never think of it as something that we can just kind of let loose with no guardrails, with no cage, because it's not tame and it never will be, and it's full of deadly poison. You let this loose, and it can bring death. And so it must always be guarded. It must always be put behind a cage so that we can make sure that it does not let loose and it does not cause all of this destruction and it does not light fires on everything around us. Verse 9, he kind of brings in the hypocrisy with the tongue, that with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Lee, after this, he kind of brings up some more illustrations of nature. Can you explain these? How are we to understand them?
Yeah, so to answer this question, I'd like to go back to verse 8 and read verses 8 through 12, because 11 and 12, it hinges upon what just came before about the tongue. We use it for blessing, can use it for blessing and cursing. So there in verse 8, no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Verses 11 and 12 reminds me of Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3 and verses 15 and 16. And it says there, I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. And so the fresh spring must bring forth the fresh water. It has to have a purpose. It has to have a very defined purpose. And so it calls into question, what is our purpose? The things that we say, are we professing God? And then also at the same tongue, are we professing things of the world and talking like the world? And so Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, I think Christ there is very emphatic in his teaching of what our purpose is. There in Matthew 6, verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And so we have a very designated purpose to serve God. And I also had in my notes Matthew 15 about what comes from the heart, what comes out of a man is what defiles him. And to tie in the illustration of the fig tree, of how a tree has to bear its fruit that it's supposed to, I thought of John chapter 15. John chapter 15, and we'll read verses 1 through 6. And it says there, Christ says there, I'm the true vine, my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. And so we have to be a part of that true vine. We have to be a branch of that true vine and bear the fruit that we're supposed to.
Right.
And to kind of tie all this together, another passage that I had was Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3 and verses 8 through 10. And it says there, but now you yourselves are to put off all these anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him. And so we can't have filthy language and blasphemy and lying, false witness of our brethren, or really anybody. And so our purpose is to serve God, and we have to do that in word and in deed.
Right. And I appreciate you bringing out that verse that we can't serve God and serve someone else or something else at the same time. Just in the same way that a spring is either fresh or it's not, right? We don't call a spring that gives salt water a fresh spring. We don't call something a fig tree if it's not bearing figs. And so for us to be blessing God and cursing men who were made in the similitude of God, that's not right. And we can't expect to be called righteous if we are trying to have it both ways. And so we, just as nature is consistent in the things that it brings and the fruit that it brings, we need to be consistent in the fruit that we bring through our words. All right, and so in verse 13, he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." I think this kind of transition to wisdom is kind of for two reasons. For one, obviously, if we're going to try to contain our tongue and use it in an effective way, we are going to desperately need wisdom in our hearts so that we can bring forth good things. And then two, remember what we started out talking about here, that let not many of you become teachers. He's talked about the dangers of the tongue and the problems that can come with that. And now he's saying, you want to know who is wise and who is understanding among you? Show that by good conduct, that your works are done in the meekness of wisdom. And then through the rest of this chapter, he goes to describe two different kinds of wisdoms. Gable, can you explain to us the two different kinds of wisdoms he shows here?
Well, beginning in verse 15, we see there's this wisdom from below, or this demonic wisdom, as James puts it. And so this wisdom is envious, it's self-seeking, boastful, lying. And then verse 16 reminds me of a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, and it really lists all of these different characteristics, and then it says that these things are from man. And so they are not from above, they are not from God. And so in contrast to that, we see this wisdom from above. And this wisdom shows good and godly conduct, as you already mentioned. And this kind of points back, I think, to chapter 1 in verse 27, where it talks about this pure and undefiled religion. And we even see that highlighted again in verse 17, where he says, first pure. So it's almost as if he's giving pure this primary emphasis here. And then he goes on, say, peaceable. So you can be reminded of Romans 12 and 18. Have peace with all men. Blessed are the peacemakers, Matthew chapter 5. And then he goes on with all of these other traits that are not self-seeking. And so bottom line, this wisdom from below is selfish, and it is self-seeking and seeking after these selfish desires. Whereas wisdom from above, it puts aside self and puts aside these selfish desires and seeks to serve others and to serve God in righteousness.
Very good. Yeah, I think of the teachings of the Pharisees and their words versus the teachings of Jesus here, right? That the bitter envy and self-seeking, that they didn't care about who they were teaching. They cared more about their position amongst their brethren. And, confusion and every evil thing are there. And you could see that bear forth with them. But then compare that to the teachings of Christ. Pure, peaceable, willing to yield, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. And he says, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And going right into chapter 4 here, he kind of calls them out, right, based on what he's just said. But where do wars and fights come from among you? Justin, where were these wars and fights coming from? And what does he mean when he's talking about the friendship with the world?
He says the wars and fights come from within their members. And the term members, Paul uses quite a bit in the book of Romans. In particular, chapter 6 and verse 19 of Romans, he says, I speak in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh, for just as you presented your members as slaves of uncleanness and of lawlessness leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves of righteousness for holiness. And in the case of these Christians James writing to, they are not presenting themselves or their members as instruments of righteousness, but rather they're warring within themselves. They're fighting against the carnal flesh. Their spirit is fighting against the flesh. And he says, you lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and you war or battle. And he mentions that they ask, first of all, he says in verse 2, you do not have because you do not ask. So they don't ask, but when they do ask, they ask for the wrong reasons, verse 3. And then in verse 4, he calls them adulterers and adulteresses, which meaning that they have basically committed adultery against their relationship with the Lord, and they've become adulterers and adulteresses with the world because they've tied themselves with the world now. And so he reminds them if they make themselves friends of the world, they make themselves an enemy of God. And then in verse 6, he says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And so all this stems from pride. We've talked about already a couple of times of the heart, the issues of the heart. And this is where it stems from, is their heart and the constant battle that's going on between their spiritual mind and the carnal flesh. And they're wanting to fulfill those fleshly desires. And James says, don't do that. You need to readjust your thoughts and your mind towards righteousness.
Yeah, they've been listening to that demonic wisdom, that's self-seeking and envious wisdom and not the wisdom of God. And therefore, these fights have come among them. All right, thank you for everyone that answered questions. We'll start with the last question here next class. And if you need any lesson 3s, they should be at the tables at all of the exits. Thank you all very much.